I used to joke that UN Week felt a bit like two tribes going to war, or at least going to talk. One tribe was a governmental tribe who had the power. The other was the NGO tribe who were trying to do good. And essentially the whole shape of the UN Week was all about how they managed to balance off against each other. Well, now it's more a case of three tribes going to talk, or going to war, hopefully to talk, because the business tribe has become increasingly important, not just in terms of helping to shape the Sustainable Development Goals, but also in terms of trying to find ways to finance it, implement them, and actually put them into action in a meaningful way, and also in some ways to broker more effective communication between the governmental and non-governmental sectors as well. Because one of the great themes that's emerged over the last year, as people have started to look at how you turn the SDGs actually into a sustainable, actionable set of policies, is that everybody has to take what I call a holistic silo-busting approach. Sitting in these different silos of governmental, non-governmental, business worlds, sitting in these different, if you like, industry groups and professional groups simply isn't going to work if any of the SDGs are going to be more than just pious rhetoric. So we have a terrifically good panel of CEOs to talk about how they look at the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, how they're trying to implement them and turn them into action. I won't waste time with long introductions, but on my immediate left, your right, is Bob Collymore, Chief Executive Officer of Safaricom, the Kenyan-based mobile phone operator that's now expanding across Africa, according to a very insightful interview in none other than the Financial Times last week. Next to him, we have Frans van Houten, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Royal Philips, the Dutch-based giant. And on the far left, your right, is Amy Jadesimi, Managing Director of Lagos Deep Offshore Logistics Base, who apparently has been described as the first female oil tycoon in Nigeria. So that makes a lot of firsts in several areas. But you are all here this week because you're very keen to be involved in the SDG discussion. I'm curious, perhaps I can start maybe with Frans. How do you make sense of the SDGs? What are they actually meaning in terms of your corporate strategy today? And what are you hoping to get out of this week?
All right, well, that's a lot of questions. Philips is a 126-year-old company. Companies need to have a reason to exist. And we are an innovation company, a technology company. And we said the only reason why we have a license to exist in maybe 10 years from now if we solve unmet needs. An innovation company should not solve yesterday's problem, but solve problems that haven't been solved yet. Right? And we come from a whole era of being a diversified company without clear focus. And then we said, let's make a choice and apply our creativity and innovation power to the unmet needs. And we looked at the Sustainable Development Goals and said, okay, you know, we can really contribute to healthy lives, access to health care, SDG number 3. And by the way, we'll do it in a way with responsible consumption and production, SDG 12, because we have been a company that had been embracing circular economy and environmental, let's say, responsible actions already for a long time. So that's what we did. And if you realize, and also very much to Arif's speech, the growth opportunities are not necessarily in the mature markets, right? And we set ourselves a goal to grow, because growth makes you, let's say, prosperous and gives you lots of opportunity. But then we said, let's have a goal not just in financial terms, but in people terms. And we said, if today our brand touches the lives of about 2 billion people,
2 billion people
every year, we would like that to become 3. Inevitably, then, we need to solve the challenges of the developing world, because we are basically already touching the majority of mature markets. So it gave us clear purpose to say we will solve the health challenges across the world, but specifically also in developing worlds. And it's amazing what it does once you have such a clear purpose, because the brightest minds want to come and work for us. They say, I'd rather apply artificial intelligence to a healthcare challenge rather than the fashion colors of next year. Right? We get investors who say, actually, we can give you a discount on your coupon, on your bond, if you hit the Sustainable Development Goal needs. And we last year placed a credit facility just doing that. There was great demand for it. Now, why am I here? Not to make it too lengthy. It's our belief that solving real hard problems cannot be done on your own in your lab, in your research center. It requires connections between other actors. Healthcare in particular is a multidisciplinary ecosystem where governments, NGOs, people, doctors, nurses, but also, let's say, companies like we are sitting here will have to come together and break through some of the barriers that exist. If it would have been easy, it would have been solved already. Right? Just to make it a little bit tangible, when we started looking at Africa as a market and said, look, maternal and infant mortality still sits at around 6%. Why are not all pregnant women scanned with ultrasound? Yeah, that's what the Western world would do. Well, it's not so easy to put ultrasound scanners in rural Africa and make sure that they keep running, after the initial time. So that just shipping in technology clearly wasn't the solution. We needed to redesign how primary care would be delivered. But maybe we can come to that later on.
Right. Well, thank you. So basically you're arguing that, doing good for the world via the Sustainable Development Goals will eventually do good for your bottom line as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And for your talent base.
I mean, there needs to be demand for a company to exist, right? And there will be demand for products and services that solve unmet needs.
Right. Bob, would you agree with that from your perspective? I mean, why are you here this week?
Yeah, I think we think that when we grow up, we want to be like Frans.
So when you grow up, you want to be Frans?
Yeah, we do, because we are a 17-year-old company, and we'd like to become a 120-year-old company.
So you're the millennials, or you're rather your Generation Z in company terms.
Let's start the millennial thing. That's going to take us down the wrong road. But if you think about the continent that we work in, it's a continent which has a need to create 1 million jobs every month, and that's not happening. It's a continent where a lot of people go to bed hungry, and as my friend Paul Pullman was saying, every night 815 million people go to bed hungry. If as businesses we don't address those issues, what kind of markets are we likely to have in the longer term? And so we in Safaricom like to think about opportunities, not challenges. And so when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, at first we thought, well, what can we do for the Sustainable Development Goals? But it rapidly became clear to us that there are actually commercial opportunities in addressing it. And so what we've done is we've chosen 9 goals. We did it kind of bottom up. 9 goals, and all of those goals are presenting a commercial opportunity to us. So why are we here? Well, we're here for 2 reasons. One is to learn from others. 2 is to partner, which is, I think, one of the more important of the SDGs, which is 17. And in fact, we're working with Philips to address some of the healthcare challenges we have for low-income Kenyans. And 3 is also for advocacy. So, both Amy and I, and Arif sits on a commission for business and sustainable development goals. Arif and I are also on the B team. But it's for advocacy, because we need more businesses to embrace these goals. We're already 2 years down a 15-year runway. And we do all need to pull together to make this thing happen, because otherwise we're going to run out of runway.
Right. Amy, what about you? Why are you here?
Thanks. So firstly, to clear something up, I'm not an oil tycoon. That's possibly the worst way you could describe what I do. Essentially...
I'm sorry, you can always blame a journalist for that, can't you? It's all those wretched newspapers.
Yeah, for so many reasons. So
I was actually very impressed, because I didn't know there were any senior women working in the Nigerian oil industry.
So I do work with the oil and gas industry. So about Ladle, quickly, because most of you have probably never heard of us. We took an empty piece of land in 2004, and between then and now, about $500 million has been invested, building it into an industrial free zone. So essentially, we've made infrastructure developments that enable large oil and gas related activities to be done in Nigeria for the first time. And as a result of that, we've halved the cost for some of these activities, which is incredibly important. And Shell just made a major investment decision based on the fact that our facility exists. Going forward, what we're now doing is diversifying away from oil and gas, leveraging our existing facility and building new infrastructure to attract in companies that want to manufacture, like Safaricom and Philips, that want to manufacture for the non-oil and gas business, for the largest growing market in the world, based on a sustainable business model. So a good example is when I was in Germany and talking about wanting to attract car manufacturers and saying, look, I don't want someone who's going to manufacture the way they were manufacturing in US in the 1970s, I very quickly got a response that there are a lot of German companies that are looking at 3D manufacturing and so on. Similarly, when we look at other industries like technology, we talk about blockchain. So Arif made a great point about the misapplication of risk, and we're having a lot of discussions in Nigeria around blockchain and how blockchain can actually be the solution to enable financial institutions to correctly assess risk, from insurance to financial allocations and so on. So there are lots of things that are happening around the world and in Nigeria that can enable companies like yours to invest in these high-growth markets and reap the benefits of operating sustainably. So what LADOL does essentially is create a platform that enables that investment to take place and that enables companies like Safaricom and Philips to scale. So we're really more of an infrastructure company, which is SDG 9, and we're about employment inequality. But the last thing I'll say about the SDGs is that it's enormously important for me as a Nigerian to spread the message that this is not CSR, this is not philanthropy. This is a situation where, as it happens, doing good and doing well go hand in hand. However, in order for companies internationally, international investors to do well, you do need indigenous investors such as ourselves to create a platform, an ecosystem. We happen to be a free zone, but you need a platform to be created where international companies can do their business on the ground. I agree completely with Royal Philips' approach, which is that you need to have research going on the ground to think up these new sustainable manufacturing techniques and ways of approaching the market. But once you have that innovation, you then need to partner with a local private company in order to scale.
Right. Well, that's very clear and certainly very inspiring. And it's certainly very encouraging, I would imagine, for most people in the room to see this idea that actually there can be a win-win-win solution for businesses getting involved. I'm just curious, I'd like to get a sense of the people who are actually in the room. Who here in the room works in the private sector in business? Okay, right, probably about 2/3, 3/4. Who here in the room works for NGOs? Okay, and who's here for government? Okay, so we have basically about 2 1/4 tribes meeting today. But so it's overwhelmingly a private sector group talking here, trying to learn from you what you're doing. And in that environment, I'm very curious, because in the past, whenever I've spoken to business leaders about dealing with the United Nations, dealing with these initiatives, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the view was, dealing with the UN is so bureaucratic, so slow-moving, so full of acronyms. We come from the private sector where we're used to taking quick decisions and implementing them, and there's rapid accountability. Why would you want to do that? I'm curious, how have you found the process to date? I mean, do you see that as business gets more involved in crafting the SDGs compared to the Millennial Development Goals, do you think the process is changing? Is it still frustrating? I mean, is it still worth it in spite of those frustrations? What are the challenges? I'm curious. Bob, you're looking like you're smiling there.
It's, well, I can summarize it as being so bureaucratic, so full of acronyms, so slow. But you can't just sit on the side and complain, because you've got a business to run, and you've got shareholders to feed, and you've got your stakeholders to feed. And so you have to get on the page and take control of the conversation. And I think that's why people like us are willingly now coming to New York in this horrible week because, you know, traffic and everything else, as you know from your own experience this morning. But we're now willingly coming, and we're really proactive in this space because you can't just leave it to the UN. The UN and indeed national governments can't achieve very much on their own. It does need, and I'm a big believer that business has the critical role to play. Governments is largely about creating, you know, enabling environments, etc. But businesses have the critical role to play because it's the private sector, it's you guys who create the jobs, it's you guys who create the wealth. And unless we are at the table, irrespective of the bureaucracy and, you know, the very long papers that they write to you, which, you know, none of us ever get past the first page, you have to be there. Right. They're smiling because they know this.
Well, it's a great job creation scheme, isn't it?
You have to be at the table to be driving that conversation.
What about you, Frans? I mean, how do you find it? Do you find that the process is shifting, or how do you? Because I know you must find it as a Dutchman who's.
I'm not sure that there is a process, but and I'm not particularly a fan of the large meetings like the WEF and the UN have, but we need it to bring people together and get to breakthroughs. Again, if you think about, let's say, healthcare in emerging markets, there is already an enormous amount of money being spent, right? Vaccination programs, but everybody does it in their own silo. And then we have an Ebola outbreak, and people suddenly realize that, oh, wow, we should have built local capacity. We should have been on the ground with infrastructure and primary care. And then we started pushing to say, yeah, but that requires to work across all those silos. That's the only way that we can, let's say, channel the existing funds that already exist and make it create something that lasts, right? That is establishing that capacity on the ground. And so you need meetings like this, and you need to find, you know, people who want to lock arms and do it together, like-minded souls. Like, for example, Philips invested in the Abraaj private equity fund because we felt that we had directionally an aligned view and we needed to put money to work, and let's just get going, because unless we do something, it never moves.
Right. I'm going to turn to you to Amy in a moment, but before I do, I mean, Bob and Frans, have you seen any sign that the sheer increase in the business involvement is making the process more efficient or easier to handle?
Well, I do see a changing.
I've sat in business in meetings with CEOs, you know, and you're paid to make quick decisions, to be clear-cut, to take accountability. You know, I'm curious whether that's actually.
Well, it's still not quick, but I do see a changing mentality where also some of the mistrust of NGOs to business is going away, and where people realize that actually we can have good intent, and the SDGs have helped to find a common language around what good intent means, right? And so now there is a platform, and we can say, well, actually, you know, we support SDG 3, and here's how we do it, right? And can we find each other in breakthroughs and building capacity and what have you? So for me, it works, notwithstanding, let's say, that it is still a tedious process to really cut through the chase and get things done.
Right.
I think relationships are evolving. Once upon a time, you know, the relationship between Frans and us would be that he would sell me light bulbs and I would sell him airtime. Now, because the framework of the SDGs, it gives us the opportunity to look at some common goals, and we can now work together to achieve goals that we identify that we have some alignment on. And it's not simply about whether I can buy more light bulbs or he could buy more airtime from us. So I think the SDGs in the past couple of years, much more so than Millennium Development Goals.
MDGs. Yes.
I have a big problem with the word millennial. The MDGs was a whole different story. You know, we're all sitting as outsiders, whereas this gives us, you know, a kind of a common agenda. I
mean, the MDGs were kind of imposed top down. The hope of the SDGs is there will be much more, you know, developing through organic conversation, which of course makes them hopelessly, you know, convoluted and unwieldy in terms of the sheer number, but that is getting more of a conversation going, isn't it?
You can get scared by the numbers. You know, I mean, I was one of those people who said 17 goals, that's a lot. 169 targets, you know, who's ever going to track those? But actually just focus. You know, we actually have chosen 9, and Philips, I'm sure, have chosen the ones that they want to go for. And once you've done that, and you put some measures around it, so in my company, you know, each one of my direct reports have their own targets and their own goals. So not everybody's doing all 9. And so, I mean, Steve, my corporate affairs director here, he has his own targets, and I measure him against performance against those targets. And so you can get yourself a bit focused on it. You don't have
Okay,
to
so it's a kind of pick and mix goals, if you like. You can pick the ones you want to focus on and really try and delegate that and get more clarity that way.
Yeah.
Amy, I'm curious about your point about getting more indigenous involvement, because that's, again, incredibly important. You know, people criticize the MDGs for not having that to the same degree. Are you seeing the process changing, and what does that mean in practical engagement in terms of what's happening this week?
I think the most useful thing about the MDGs was that they demonstrated that the paternalistic top-down model was basically a nonsense.
So it showed what not to do.
Well, exactly. Combine that with the fact that the MDGs were largely achieved because of China and Brazil, which basically opted out of the MDGs. You had a UN that developed the SDGs based on an understanding that you actually needed to take the whole world into consideration, put everybody on a level playing field, empower the local markets to decide how they wanted to achieve the goals themselves, and to engage private sector. So the local private sector companies like ours have largely been shut out of the market, not just by our own governments, but by international governments and international institutions. You know, a small private sector company investing in infrastructure, so 10-year return on your money in Nigeria, you can guess how hard it was for us to raise finance. I mean, it was virtually impossible, even though the business plan, you know, fundamentally is unbelievably strong. But now what we have is a world where the UN is actively trying to engage with the local private sector companies, the World Bank, the same thing. Jim Kim has spoken about this on several occasions, saying how he's trying to realign the World Bank to engage with local private sector, because it's understood that the indigenous private sector is the key to success. And certainly what we've achieved at LADOL has shown that in the oil and gas sector, which is the hardest sector in Nigeria to change, you know, that is certainly the case. In terms of international investors, though, since I have a captive audience here, apart from the allocation of risk, there's also the time horizon for investment. If you're looking to participate in the $12 trillion that the achieving, or more, up to $28 trillion, that aligning yourselves with the SDGs will result in, then you've got to be looking at a long-term horizon. Now, when I was a banker in the early 90s, long-term was 20 years. No, sorry, by then it was already, long-term was 10 years by then, and short-term, because of all the tech stuff, was like a couple of months or 3 months. So it was just ridiculous. I think we need to go back to the 80s and the 70s, where long-term is 20 years, and mid-term is 10 years, and short-term is 5 years. And that's very important, because if you don't have that sort of time horizon in view, you're just going to miss out on all the investments. You're not going to be able to allocate your capital correctly.
But I'm curious, again, since you do have a room full of captive investors, given that you are in the oil and gas sector, or you started there, I know you say you're trying to diversify now. I mean, that for many people in UN Week is #1 target in terms of not seeming to be part of the sustainability conference. I mean, how do you deal with that aspect in terms of your investor base?
So the SDGs, so when you say sustainable industrial free zone, and I'm talking to a Western audience, immediately they think climate change. If I'm talking to an audience from a low-income, high-growth country like Nigeria, they think job creation. So the first thing is, and I agree with Frans on this, the SDGs give us a universal language. So it's not just about climate change. If you look at it in terms of the SDGs, if you look at our business in terms of the SDGs, clearly we're scoring on job creation. We're on course to generate about 50,000 new jobs in Nigeria on infrastructure development and diversity and so on. But when you're talking to oil and gas companies, they are also changing their business models in Nigeria to be more sustainable. Not so much 100% on the climate change side at the moment, but more on the local content side. Local content means doing things locally, so fabricating locally, doing your engineering locally, and so on, because they see that as a way of creating more stability. It lowers their cost, it lowers their risk, and they are also looking at a long-term investment horizon. So if an IOC is investing in a deep offshore block in Nigeria now, they're looking at the next 20, 25 years. So even though, you know, in some aspects of the SDGs they fall down, in others they're actually good partners for us.
Right. And just another question, I'm curious. I mean, one of the elements that's come into the SDGs, which wasn't so present before in the MDGs, is this idea of measurement, of actual trying to assess what has or hasn't worked, which again is very much a business mentality being brought to bear. So I'm sure most people in the room would welcome that. How easy is it for any of you to actually measure any of this?
For me, it's fairly easy. I mean, if I look at climate, we have set ourselves as a company a goal of becoming net zero by the year 2050. And so every year we're going to be measuring our carbon footprint, and it's good to see that we're heading in the right direction. And that's just one example. So, you do need to set measures. As business people, if you're not measuring it, you're not really doing it. And I think if you choose the ones carefully, then of course you can measure it.
Right. Frans, do you have a system for measuring this?
Absolutely. We measure everything. But I find it very obvious. We will be zero carbon by 2020.
He's getting there before me. Wow.
We will be. We will
have. You're supposed to be the kid on the block.
We will have 15% circular economy business model revenue by 2020, and so on. So everything has goals. And when I said, we want to reach 3 billion lives by 2025, we measure that. Right? It's on our website, completely transparent. You can exactly see who we reach where, just not by name, but. How people use our products and services. I do think measurement is extremely important. But for me, it's like a hygiene factor, really.
Right. Amy, what about you? How are you measuring?
No, I agree. I think that to develop metrics against the 17 SDGs and 169 goals is relatively easy. More importantly, though, particularly for a small company like ours, is there's also a direct correlation between those outcomes and your profitability. So I think because we're a new company, we basically had SDGs embedded even before there were SDGs. It's relatively easy for us to continue that through as we grow. But what really drives that, what makes it sustainable, is, if you like, is that success in those metrics also leads to success for the company.
Right.
That's a really important point that Amy's made. Recently Investec did a report which showed a direct correlation between companies who scored high on ESGs and their performance. So it's not a mythical thing. I'm fortunate that my company is one of the top 3, together with I think the Standard Chartered Bank and another local company. So there is a direct correlation. The problem is that shareholders, particularly short-term shareholders, and if the Americans in the room will forgive me, I think Americans and Brits do take a bit of a short-term approach. Mm-hmm. If you take the Northern Europeans, if I go to Stockholm or Denmark and I speak to investors, they do want to know where are we going to be in 15 years' time. Whereas when you sit in front of an institutional investor here, he's just kind of pumping into, what's your revenue target next year, what's your EBITDA, and that's very short term, and that becomes difficult for us as corporate leaders to deal with.
Right. Sorry, you look like Frans. You want to say
something? So I think you need a balance between short term, long term, obviously. But if I look at the value of the Philips brand, it was built over many, many years. And maybe some of the people who are now in developing markets will be driving demand for us in 25 years. If we engage with them now on breakthroughs for primary care, I'm sure they will remember that, and that will contribute to prosperity in the future. So it's important that you look at a multi-stakeholder approach. You look at the value it creates, both in the short term and in the long term, and you take a balanced approach to it. I think that kind of inclusivity gets you to drive preference for your brand, therefore demand. I see more and more, also in mature markets, people place a lot of emphasis on that, as they want to justify that they are living up to sustainable development goals, and therefore having your house in order works across the world.
Right. Well, I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a moment, because I realise that you're all very expert in this, and many of you got expertise, so you probably want to either share or ask a question. But just before I do, I'm curious, Do any of you have any sort of shining examples of success in the last year of dealing with the United Nations and the SDGs you'd like to share?
We'll let you go first.
Well,
And you can say that without, please don't turn this into a kind of promotional ad for your company.
No.
I'm
But
curious about the process.
look,
How do you
I've
actually-
talked about primary care and how hard it is to solve. And here's also where Safari.com and we are working together on, but this very active support of the special envoy of the United Nations in Kenya. And you know, if you talk about providing universal health coverage for everybody, then you need to solve access to primary care in rural Africa. And these are communities where there is nothing, right? And where a single little hospital or primary care clinic can serve 40,000 people. And so we have developed that concept, tested it, improved it. We have a research lab in Nairobi because to have a locally relevant innovation, you need to be on the ground. Very much believe in that. And recently we opened one in Mandera County, which is still a very difficult place. And it also made us realize that building a primary care clinic is not just about the clinic, it's about the staff, but it is also about the supply chain. It's also about the communications. We learned that you can actually ship the medication there with a drone from a nearby city.
With a drone?
With a drone, because now once
So
you
now
have a
drones
clinic...
flying over.
Yeah, and that is not us, but a local startup in Nairobi is actually doing that. So that's how you involve local startups in creating a supply chain for medication, which otherwise would have been very difficult.
So development by drone.
Well, it's
a great idea.
You know, for healthcare, you need to create an integral solution, which is multidisciplinary. Philips can provide the technology for scanning people, diagnosing people, but then they need medication, right? So the point that I'm making is multi-stakeholder approach, involve the local community, but also involve other disciplines like a tech company like Safari.com. We have now realized we also need to involve the pharma world and invite one or two pharma companies to say, if you want to be part of this business endeavor, be our guest. You need to become a stakeholder in it. You need to put money at risk, but you can create a value chain into communities that will need a lot of medication down the road because of all the non-communicable diseases. Right? So what I like about this event and that I'm convinced that for lasting solutions, for example, around primary care in emerging markets, you need to bring people together and businesses together that will together be entrepreneur in this. And then I think there can be very good profits made across this, because if we all share a little piece of the puzzle in our own specialty, you create something that can truly flourish.
Right.
There's an interesting
so Bob,
response.
beat development by drone.
Well, no, there's an interesting response that Francis has given you, because the question you asked was, you know, a shining example of where the UN plays a critical role. And the answer he's given you actually shows that the UN doesn't play a critical role on its own. It is the partnerships. We're back to goal number 17. And, you know, he's given you an example where there's some private companies have come together, the government of Kenya have come together, the UNFPA have come together, and that's at the heart of the goals. It is about partnerships. Philips can achieve quite a bit on their own, but they will never be able to achieve the kind of things that they will achieve if they work in partnership with across these agencies, across civil society, across private sector, and across public sector.
So it's really looking at the UN as a facilitator,
Exactly.
if you like, of actually connecting people.
Absolutely, that's a good word. Convening power is tremendous.
Which again is quite different from the past, when essentially the UN was trying to convene people to almost tell people what to do. Now it's more trying to convene to create these bottom-up solutions.
Yeah.
Amy, do you have any favourite stories you'd like to tell us about shining successes?
What I would say is, and we are working with the division of the UN now, but I think the UN has given us this framework. The fact that the framework was put together largely by the current Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, is enormously helpful. So we do feel like they have taken more ownership of it. But in taking ownership of it, they have deliberately led through an empowerment model. So, the feedback we get from them is put these partnerships together and we can validate. We can tell you how the framework is supposed to be applied and help, people like the organizations in the audience understand how they can reach into these markets. And that, I think, is a much more powerful and ultimately successful role they're playing now than the one they played in the past.
Right, right. Well, listen, let's bring the audience in, because I know a lot of people are involved in this debate as well. I think there are microphones around. If I can see hands wave. Wow, hands popping up already. There's clearly high engagement right now. It would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. Please be very short, because I can see lots of hands already. We don't want long speeches. And if you want someone to answer your question specifically, please indicate who you're directing it towards.
Okay, I'll be courteous. I'm Debbie McCoy. I'm an investor at BlackRock. I'm interested in the proliferation of folks who would like to rate companies on their performance against the Sustainable Development Goals, in addition to things like ESG and other characteristics. I wonder how you, as chief executives, are thinking about how to deal with the myriad of definitions that might exist against the SDGs.
Great question.
Well, Frans will take that one.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, there is no clear-cut measurement for companies in this context. And it led the World Economic Forum with a small group to write the Compact for Responsive and Responsible Entrepreneurship. And that's entirely anchored on the SDGs. And then a few companies in the International Business Council decided to develop a scoring mechanism around it, among which Thomson Reuters and a few others. That was presented a few weeks ago in Geneva, and I'm sure it will be presented in Davos in January next year. And it should then become, hopefully, a measurement tool around, let's say, sustainable development for companies.
So benchmarks are evolving.
Yeah, it starts with transparency, because you need to measure all the companies, and then you can see who is best in class, and that becomes your benchmark.
Right, interesting. We don't have, obviously, I know later in the day you have investors speaking. It'd be interesting to know the degree to which they are or are not using those benchmarks. But we've got a question over here.
Laura Koch, chair of the Social Engagement Network of YPO, Young Presidents Organization. We represent 26,000 CEOs around the world, and I have one company too. But my question is about long-term and vision of companies. And all of you mentioned this, and over a few years ago, Paul Polman, Unilever, came up with a great idea of saying, okay, let's report every 6 months. And he thought he was going to lead the way, but he hasn't. So what is your opinion? What are your thoughts? What are the challenges that this has not happened? Thank you.
Well, I think Paul has led the way. It's just that not many people have been smart enough to follow. We report on a 6-month cycle, despite a lot of pressure to go quarterly. But quarterly absolutely makes no sense. First of all, it burns up a lot of time preparing these numbers every few months. But it sets the wrong conversation with your investors, because they just want to know what you're going to do over the next 3 years, the next 3 months. Whereas the conversation that I would rather have is, what are we going to do over the next 5 years? And I think we're beginning to see a larger and larger coalition of companies that are beginning to stand up to this quarterly reporting cycle, the tyranny of the quarter reporting cycle. But I mean, I think Paul still does set the leadership, and a number of us are following it, but not enough.
Frans, you look a bit doubtful.
I'm torn on this topic, because actually I believe that a quarterly update on performance is very healthy for a company. And I don't think it stops us from having a long-term vision. I do always point out to shareholders not to look at the quarter, but at the MAT, the 12, the moving averages, trend lines, because that is what tells you more about the company. I do think that Paul was very courageous in setting this example, and since we are both Dutch, he he implored on me several times, why don't you change it? And frankly speaking, I didn't think that I would have the support from my shareholders yet to make that change. We are still a company that is improving its, let's say, track record. And I believe that short-term transparency can actually help achieve that. And once again, I don't think that having a quarterly cycle prohibits me from having a long-term commitment at all.
Right. You're private, aren't you, from memory? Is that right? Amy?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we're 100% private.
We're private,
Yeah.
so you're freed from
Good
any
for
any requirement to report.
I think, well, I mean, and also my business is completely different in a way because it's a new business. We had what would be considered was a revolutionary business model for Nigeria, let alone on the international market. But I think this issue of quarterly reporting is incompatible with having a sustainable company. Sorry to disagree with you, but I think if you're a very large company and you're established and every quarter you're saying the same thing because you're already established, that's fine. But even for young startups in Silicon Valley, but certainly if you're looking at investing the 2 to 3 trillion that needs to be invested in low growth, in high growth, low income countries, quarterly reporting is a nonsense. I think it really depends on you in the audience to change the tone. It's what you demand. So if you demand that Moody's give a credit rating that takes into account the SDGs, they will do so. If you demand that the companies you invest in come with plans on a 3 to 5 to 10 to 20-year basis, they will do so. But at the moment, speaking as a relatively small private sector company from a part of the world no one wants to invest in, no one's asking for that. What they're asking for is 100% guarantee on their money, 20% guaranteed return each year. So the conversation hasn't evolved. Thankfully for companies like ours, the market in Nigeria has evolved. The solutions we've put together for ourselves has evolved. So what I see happening is we will get, it'll be like another China, Brazil. We'll get big enough to the point where we don't actually need your money, and that's the point at which you'll now come and offer us money on terms that make sense.
Frans, when you talk to other companies, I realize that you and Paul Polman have got different views on this. And I say that one of the reasons I love having a Dutch representative on every single panel is they're wonderfully frank and upfront and honest. But when you and Paul have your disagreements, how do you think most of the other CEOs are breaking on that divide about the need for...
Well, and Paul and I have many agreements.
Right.
Mostly. I mean, we entirely agree on the Sustainable Development Goals and on the long-termism and on this compact for responsible leadership and stakeholder and inclusiveness. So I would say we agree on 99%.
Right.
So is it really important to drill down on the 1%?
Well, no, okay, let me turn the question and say, you're not being Dutch at all now. Let me ask it differently then. When you talk to investors, like people in the room, do they get it?
Yeah,
do they see through your quarterly numbers and actually want to look at the longer term?
The shareholder base in Philips is actually shifting. From, I mentioned that we used to be diversified industrial holding and people actually could not really value us. We are now a much more focused company. We have become a smaller company. We divested of some of the commodity businesses. We are now focused on healthcare that attracts a new set of shareholders. Actually, I need that regular dialogue with shareholders to convey that we have a compelling shareholder proposition for the long term, not for the short term, right? And that I invite people to join that franchise. And I don't see how I could do that if I would only talk to them annually, right? And then you could have said courageously, I'll only publish results every half year. But since I need to have the dialogue, you would end up giving a lot of proxies for financial performance anyway. So you might as well report. But once again, what we report, we can influence. Nobody tells you that you should put only emphasis on your quarterly profit. You can actually choose on how you want to report, and you can therefore focus a lot on elements that drive your long-term performance and make people focus on that.
But underlying this, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done with shareholders. And shareholders, in order for shareholders to see beyond even the 12-month cycle, shareholders by and large, and actually, we were having this conversation about millennials earlier, and I promised not to bring the subject up.
No, please do. I think millennials are fascinating.
But the kids who are sitting there in front of their laptops when the CEO comes on their reporting cycle, they just are just looking at the numbers. You know, they're not going to ask me any questions about what's happening about reducing inequalities in the market that you're operating. And that's a really, really important question. Because of inequalities and injustices, you end up with things like the Arab Spring. And, you know, some years down the line, when you look at the Arab Spring and you say, who wants to go, hands up those who wants to go and invest in Libya today. Hands up those who wants to go and invest in Syria. So investors need to start to take that long-term view to make life easier. And one of the things that Frans said earlier, he slipped it in when he says that he didn't believe that he'd be able to get it past the shareholders, because it is actually a tough gig to go back to the shareholders and say, I only want to come talk to you about the long-term story, notwithstanding the fact that you still do need to have a bit of a short-term conversation.
But I'm curious, I'm going to turn to the next question in just a moment. I'm curious on this thread though, because as Arif pointed out, increasingly retail money matters. You know, we do have a situation where an enormous amount of trillions of money on the global stage is invested in negative yielding bonds, frankly, in a crazy way that shows just how broken the system is. And yet we also have a situation where all the surveys of, you know, wealthy families in the US today, or even less wealthy, shows that the millennial generation does have different priorities for investing, and they actually do want to place more emphasis on sustainability. Do you see that impacting how shareholders talk to you now, or is that still simply one step away from the whole ecosystem change?
The one who's closest to millennials can answer that question.
I mean, as a former banker, I can say this. I think the investing community needs to be smarter. I think that you need better financial products, and to take those to the shareholders and explain to them why they should care about these things. You know, you have a different range of shareholders, but if you're looking particularly at institutional shareholders, they're not going to be on the cutting edge of finance. They're not going to come up with the innovation. So it's up to us to a certain extent, but you know, also the financial managers to come up with that innovation and explain why it matters, and explain why if we keep doing what we're doing, in 5-10 years there isn't going to be a business left. And I think that conversation isn't happening, in part because there aren't enough new financial products, and there hasn't been enough thinking done in places like New York to go to shareholders and give them a new product that makes sense. And as Arif said, it's kind of a shame, because somehow the financial community, including the bank I used to work for, managed to get trillions of dollars invested into new financial products that made no sense. And here we're talking about a financial product that makes absolute sense, and yet for some reason that conversation and that education isn't happening.
I don't think there's enough millennial dollars in that investment pot to make a difference, to be honest.
You don't think there's enough millennial dollars in the investment pot to make a difference?
Yeah.
At the moment, though, I mean, the US is about to see the biggest wealth transfer in history as the baby boomers retire and die off and pass over trillions to the next generation, to the millennials. Won't that change things?
And I hope they continue to behave the way they do, because as they mature, as they start to get children and grandchildren, you know, let's hope that they hold firm to those beliefs. I mean, the other big problem you've got actually is a friend of mine, Sharon Burrows, who's the General Secretary of the International Trade Union, she always says, it's the workers' money. And I said, Sharon, you know, it's the workers' money, but the people who are making the decision is not the workers. It's the kid who sits behind the laptop, and he makes decisions just based on numbers. And so whilst the workers should be caring about 15, 20 years from now, and that you still have a market in which our businesses can operate, the people who are making decisions are not looking at it that way.
But more and more funds are having criteria around sustainability and development goals. So maybe it's not big enough yet, but at least there is an increasing awareness that funds need to cater for new sets of investors.
Yes. I must say I'm fascinated, because I think it was a survey I saw recently from US Trust showing, you know, the amount of money that's being transferred over the next decade or two as, you know, the kids inherit in America, just in America, is absolutely enormous. And the attitudes of those kids who are going to inherit are so different that asking, as Bob says, whether they will continue to embrace sustainability once they actually have their hands on the money will be fascinating to see that. Anyway, got a question at the back and then a question over there. So let's do there and then at the back.
Hello, my name is Mara Bolis, and I'm from Oxfam. Thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating conversation. And I had a question directed at Mr. Van Houten from Philips. In terms of the example that you brought up about and I completely agree with what you were saying in terms of breaking out of silos and multidisciplinary approaches. I think that that's where the real creativity lies for us to address many of the challenges that are brought to us by the SDGs. In the example that you named, it seemed like the multi-stakeholder partnership was fundamentally driven by partnerships between private sector actors. So I wondered if you could respond to what the role is from your perspective of NGOs on the ground in those types of solutions, and where you have seen successful NGO engagement. Thank you.
Well, so the question relates to what we call the community life centers, right? These primary care facilities that include clean water, solar energy, and then a clinic. Actually, NGOs are involved, and luckily increasingly so. Many of the vaccination programs are actually run by NGOs, and there's a lot of money there, and they all struggle with the cold mile, the last mile of reaching the population. Moreover, there is no registration of who actually gets vaccinated. And if there would have been, then in a case of a pandemic, we could have found the source of the Ebola crisis much earlier. So the realization that to really build capacity at primary care level, that you need to work together is there. And the mistrust between, let's say, all the participants, NGOs, governments, private enterprise, is going away. And maybe that is also one of the consequences of the language around SDGs. So I've seen it change over the last 3-4 years. So I'm very optimistic about it. It does take a lot of meetings, but we are, let's say, coming together. And I think that is very encouraging. Now, we are still working on scaling, because I think once you have validated a concept, that's great, but now you need to scale it. And we have calculations that let's say, to solve primary care for the next 2 billion people, you need several 100,000 primary care clinics. In Africa alone, if you do the math, that a primary care clinic serves about 40,000 people, then again, you need a lot. So the next challenge is not to validate the concept, but actually to validate the business model. Abraaj is also helping us, let's say, to come to sustainable business models. I sometimes joke, we need to roll this out as the McDonald's of primary care, right? Where they are all sprinkled around, and you have local entrepreneurs in the franchise that run these clinics. But so it's very exciting. NGOs are coming on board, to your question. We all need to get rid of our cold water fear and just start doing it. I'm prepared as an entrepreneur to create a special purpose vehicle in which multiple companies can invest. Then you can also have your financial reporting on it, complete transparency and its own governance. I think that's probably the way that this will scale, and that's what we are driving for.
All right. Got a question towards the back.
Dorji Mundell from BSR. I'm really heartened to see corporations, big corporates, on the panel, an impact investing panel, because historically impact investing and big corporates were not really too often in the room together. I'm interested to hear your thoughts as to the advice you'd give to other CEOs and senior business leaders about the potential for impact investing to play a role in helping you scale up new business models and to overcome the kind of market inefficiencies and failures that occur at each stage of the value chain across many of the markets in which you operate.
Bob, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're the problem with this, the title of impact investing, you should be running your business for impact. You shouldn't just be running your business to make a profit. Because if all you want to do is to make a profit, then actually you can do drug running or something else. And clearly, you don't want to do that, right? So you actually do draw the line about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so businesses, when we think of our company, we think that we want to transform lives. And then we do everything we do in the company, we say, is it going to transform lives or isn't it? And the fellow next to me is the same thing. You know, he doesn't just want to be I think the phrase used once was second only to the sun in lighting up the world. You know, he actually defines this is true, right? You are the second only to the sun. You know, he actually wants to make an impact in running his business. So impact investing isn't something that you do in a niche way. I think that's the way we used to think about it. But businesses need to start with a purpose.
Mm. Bob and I differ slightly on this, because I think that if you ask businesses to do something more than give a return to shareholders as the basic criteria, I think you get into trouble. And it's harder for people to adopt, because then you get into subjectivity. I also think it's not necessary to ask people to take a social position on this. I think if you just take a business position and you want your business to be around in 10 years, then you're going to need a sustainable business model. So fortunately, in this case, you don't even need to go to any other place. Secondly, I think in terms of what CEOs can do, firstly, set goals. So, you know, have metrics based on the SDGs. Secondly, allow the millennials working in your company to innovate. I think too often now, particularly when it comes to investing in high-growth, low-income markets, people aren't allowed to innovate. There are so many restrictions put, you know, as soon as you go into the room and say Nigeria, you know, the next thing you better say should be government and, you know, who's going to cover my risk. So that ability to innovate within these metrics that have been defined by the CEO is really important. And I understand that you can't switch over, you know, in 1 year or 2 years or even 10 years. But if you have a department that is tasked with that and that is focusing on that and is looking out for the future of the company, I think that'll be a big start, especially if you put the smartest people into that department, because that's what it's about. It's about smart people coming up with good ideas. There's nothing, you know, about this type of investing that's particularly complicated or challenging. You just need to put the right brains in the room to figure out how you can make money doing it.
Right.
I mean, for business to succeed long term, you need to, and it certainly applies for an innovation company, you need to solve unmet needs. And for us to embrace sustainability, we have started doing that 15 years ago. It's no longer an afterthought or a tick mark. It's an integral part of how to do business. And everybody knows it in the company. Bob was referring to the fact that we have a lighting affiliate. We sell light as a service. We retain ownership of the technology platform. We can now design the technology platform to last longer. And moreover, we can take back the parts in a circular fashion. The buyer in buildings, they just want the benefit of the light. I mean, this is great. We are the company that pioneered light as a service. And it is getting us major clients who say, actually, I don't want to have the capex of light you know, fixtures and solve this problem for me. So the notion of embracing, in this case, energy efficiency and circular economy is a new business model that drives demand, right, and makes us more profitable. It's a way of thinking, and you're right, creativity needs to be on the ground, and people come with these ideas in Philips all the time, and I find it very rewarding, and so it's a holistic approach.
Right, right. Sadly, we are almost out of time. Before we just finish, I'd like to ask, do you three think that the SDGs will be met by 2030?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Probably.
Well, since you're actually closer on the ground to that on a day-by-day basis, well, that's still a pretty positive answer. So it just remains for me to say thank you for a fascinating discussion. The fact you are here, as one of the commentators said from Oxfam, you know, is a sign of changing times. Good luck with navigating the bureaucracy or the acronyms, the traffic and the weather this week. But thank you for doing that, because it's certainly taking business and investing into a new place. And let's hope that this week will be fruitful. So thank you.